Okay, good day, everybody. Today we are going to talk Napoleon. We're going to talk about Napoleon the man, talk about his military conquests, what made him successful. He is one of the biggest figures in European history. If you were making a Mount Rushmore of the most significant people in European history, Napoleon would have to be on there. He's one of these outsized guys. There's a lot of debate in history about, does the moment make the man or does the man make the moment? And I truly believe there's very few figures in European history where the individual makes the moment, where the individual changes the course of history so dramatically, more so than the events that are pushing this person along. And I think Napoleon is one of those guys that dramatically altered the direction of European history. And I think this quote from Professor Kagan sums it up really well. He says, "No other figure besides Napoleon has distorted his era as much as Napoleon did. No other great wars of the modern world bear the name of the leader of a single belligerent. We don't call them the Hitler Wars. We don't call them the German Wars, the Bismarck Wars, the Wars of Philip II. We don't do that. But we do call them the Napoleonic Wars in the Napoleonic era." Now, a lot of this lecture is from the book I just quoted from, called The End of the Old Order, Napoleon in Europe, 1801 to 1805, by Frederick Kagan. This is the middle of three books that Kagan wrote on it. This one just covers the 4 years, 1801 to 1805, and including the notes, it's 700 plus pages. Kagan actually read all the documents, not just in the original English, but he spoke French and German and learned Russian so that he could read all the accounts in the original language. And so his research is just impeccable, and his account and description of Napoleon really has become one of the definitive ones. So let's first talk about Napoleon the man. Who was he? What was going on inside his head? What made him who he was? And I don't want to say this is putting him on the couch and psychoanalyzing him, but this is getting inside of his head to look at the concepts that really address everything that we're going to talk about after. And so one of the qualities that he had was his inability to recognize impossibility. Napoleon never believed any situation he was in was hopeless, whether it was military on the battlefield or diplomatic, political in the negotiating table. He continued to see opportunities long after his enemies thought he was done. And he just kept on pushing and kept on going because he thought he could always win. Now, this obviously served him well in a lot of instances because he grasped victory from the jaws of defeat many, many times. But there was a negative to it. There was another side to it. And that was when the situation really was hopeless, when it might have been better to draw back to fight another day, again, either militarily or politically. He didn't do that. And especially the men under his command sometimes suffered because of it. Now let's talk about one of the things that made him great. His military genius and even his political genius to a certain extent was his remarkable agility and flexibility. Not like gymnastics flexibility or anything like that. But he always had a plan, an overarching plan, a goal, whether it was to get certain territory, to defeat a certain army, to get certain concessions from enemy diplomats. And he was always willing to adjust and change and audible along the way. He didn't have everything set in stone from the outset. And so it really made him hard to pin down and figure out his plans because he was constantly adjusting his plans. And so I think that's an important thing to realize about Napoleon. And then a third idea was his ambition. He not just desired to be Charlemagne, he really felt he was entitled to be Charlemagne. He felt his ability put him above everybody else, and he wanted the title to go with his ability. There was a lot of kings in Europe. There was even numerous emperors, whether that was in Austria or the Tsar of Russia. And he didn't want to just be a king. He didn't want to just be emperor of a country. He truly desired to be emperor of Europe. And that is one of his overarching kind of drives behind him. So now, the first conversation I want you to have, you're actually going to need your notes that you took last night from the Hunt reading. And I want you to talk about the story of Napoleon with your partner. Take about 2 minutes and just talk about where he came from, what he did, what he accomplished. And don't get too bogged in detail. Just kind of make sure you go over the greatest hits. What was, if you were summing up the story of Napoleon, what did he do? So take about 2 minutes and do that. So let's talk about Napoleon's rise now that you've had that conversation, his rise from republic to empire. So Napoleon really gets his start. He actually was in military school. He was from Corsica. He didn't speak French really well, spoke it with an accent. And he was a corporal. He was in charge of artillery. He really gets his rise defending the National Convention. There's a band of royalists who are trying to bring down the convention, and he's assigned to disperse the crowd, and he does it with what he calls a whiff of grape shot. Essentially, he shoots cannons into the crowd and disperses the crowd and saves the National Convention and becomes a hero of the revolution for this. He's then sent to Italy, where he's remarkably successful. So much so that the convention starts fearing for his ambition. He then goes to Egypt after that, where he's not as successful, but the goal was to defeat the British in Egypt. But all of these things are building his legends. Even his failures in Egypt, he doesn't tell people about. So his legend is just growing. Now, this brings us to the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire. Brumaire is the month of November. It actually means fog. It's the month of November in the revolutionary calendar. Coup d'etat means blow of state. Basically, it implies a takeover of a government. It can be a bloodless coup. It can be a bloody coup. But that phrase coup d'etat is an important one to know. We're going to use that a lot moving forward. Essentially, as your reading talked about, he overthrew the Directory with the help of his powerful friends, including his wife, Josephine. Eventually, he has himself named First Consul in the Constitution of 1799, which means he's the boss of the other consuls. And then he has an election. He has a plebiscite to see if he should be crowned emperor in 1804. And overwhelmingly, he gets the support of the French people. But then this is where this is where Napoleon knows his history. And the story goes that right as the Pope was about to put the crown onto Napoleon, essentially investing him, this is going all the way back to our Middle Ages, investing, Napoleon takes the crown and puts it on himself. Because if the Pope, again, puts the crown on him, it implies that the Pope has the ability to take it away, that the Pope is more powerful. So Napoleon doesn't want that, so he takes it and puts the crown on himself. And that's kind of a nice little parallel going back to our Middle Ages there. So now let's talk about Napoleon's military conquest. How did he do it? I say there's 6 reasons why Napoleon was so successful militarily. And some of these that were talked about in your reading, actually. One of them that was talked about in your reading was the draft. The draft was hugely important. He had a tremendously large army. He had a far larger army than anybody else in Europe from which to pull his soldiers from. But the military also allowed social mobility, and so that is going to tie in because he's moving people up based on their ability, not just on their titles or anything like that. And that draft was a big part of it. Tying into that is the second reason why Napoleon was so successful, and that is the nationalism of his soldiers. We're really getting the birth of modern nationalism when soldiers are fighting for a state, not just for a general. They're fighting for an idea. They're fighting for France against the enemies of France. And that morale boost was so incredibly important to Napoleon's success. It allowed them his armies to be much more successful, and he fed that. Also this ties into that idea of social mobility because they were fighting for themselves also and their possible betterment. So that's the second reading. We have the draft, we have nationalism of soldiers. Third reason he's successful was also in your reading, was his leadership. He was remarkable. He was an amazing, amazing military leader. He saw things better than most others around him. And he was able to move pieces around, artillery, foot soldiers, cavalry, like chess pieces. I believe your reading talked about how an enemy said that his leadership was worth 50,000 men. Just him being there, and not just the way he moved the pieces, but also the way he inspired his soldiers. A fourth reason was his speed. Every contemporary in here, from Prussia to Austria to the Russians, they talk about how fast Napoleon's army moved and how just all of a sudden they were on them. They were to the next town. They were to the next river before anybody could expect them from being there. Now, this ties into the way he utilized his troops. Now, you're reading, and we've talked about in the past too, how armies foraged for food, which is, of course, just a fancy way of saying, yeah, they stole it. They collected it from the people in the area, the farms from the area, the towns from the area. And what Napoleon did really successfully was he actually usually divided his army into two different big lines, two different big columns. And so they weren't trying to forage from the same spot. And so they were able to collect food more quickly, and they were able to move more quickly. Now, he was able to do this because of his aforementioned, his incredible ability and flexibility to move people around, and just his genius. So his speed was one of his great reasons why he was able to be so successful. Talking about food, a famous quote, Napoleon wrote a book of military maxims, he called them. He said, an army marches on its stomach. So take a second and talk about that quote. What did Napoleon mean by that? An army marches on its stomach. Being that this is right after Thanksgiving, I think that we can all appreciate the importance of a good meal. After all, it's important to have food. These guys can't fight. They can't march. They can't go on long marches if they're not fed. So we've got draft, nationalism, leadership, speed. The fifth reason that Kagan really talks about a lot is Napoleon's command of logistics. Napoleon actually had a famous quote. He says, amateurs study tactics. Professionals study logistics. And this again ties into the way he supplied his army. Logistics are making sure you have everything you need, making sure you have enough food, making sure you have enough ammunition, enough boots, even something as simple as that. Knowing how long it's going to take you to get from point A to point B, knowing what your enemies have between that point. And he was a master of logistics, and it really was his incredible mind, his incredible intellect that allowed him to keep all of these moving pieces straight. And so his command of logistics is what I say is his fifth reason why he was so successful. The sixth reason, I would say, and again, this is citing Kagan here, you should just read it. I just could skip this lecture. You could just read this thing in all your spare time. He talks about the lack of coordination of his enemies. Russia, Prussia, Austria were all often as much suspicious of each other and fearful of each other as they were of Napoleon, and they didn't always work together. Prussia sits out one of the coalitions completely. And so they're not all working together. England can't get all of them to coordinate their efforts. England's essentially offering everybody money if they would just all work together, and they can't all get it together. So that lack of coordination was a very big piece. So there's the 6 reasons. What I want you to do is take a minute with your partner and talk about which one you think is the most important and why. Make an argument why that is the most important reason for Napoleon's success. All right, now I know we just talked a few minutes about how Napoleon was, the greatest general and everything like that, and he was. A lot of his battles are actually still studied at military schools today. There is a book that shows a counterpoint, though. It's called Blundering to Glory by Owen Connolly. And essentially the crux of this book is that Napoleon was far more lucky than he was good. that it was the failures of his enemies, and that it was his soldiers and his field marshals and aide-de-camps that gave him so many of his victories. And he wasn't as great of a military tactician as a lot of people give him credit for. So I just think it's interesting to see that there's at least another side there as well. So now, moving on, let's talk about the Peace of 1805. So this is one of the big transformative events during the Napoleonic era. After Napoleon completely defeated Austria in 1805, the peace he settled transformed Europe more than any since the treaties that ended the 7 Years' War. Essentially, he's going to completely reshape Central Europe with this. He dismantles the Holy Roman Empire. It is no more. Moment of silence for the Holy Roman Empire. Thank you very much. And it breaks Germany officially into 3 camps. There's the Austrian group, there's the Prussian states, and then there's what we call the Third Germany. And what Napoleon's going to do is, through alliances and his personal will, he is going to dominate the Third Germany. That Third Germany is the German states that aren't allied with either Prussia or Austria. That's what I have as the arrow there for Third Germany. And with this breakup, this is going to fundamentally alter the balance of power. It's going to change the way these states interact with each other. And then 2 years later, after he defeats Austria again, and then Russia and Prussia, he's able to negotiate separate peaces. He actually deals with each state separately and secretly, so that the others don't know what Napoleon is offering them, so that the others don't know what he's offering the other states, which really enables Napoleon to get the best deal for France and really come at Europe from a complete position of power. So let's take a look at his empire here, and I'm going to flip to the map real quick. It's on the back page of your lecture there. So Napoleon's empire, his Grand Empire, Europe, the Napoleonic Empire, really is divided into 3 spots. And we have the French Empire, which is what he saw as the traditional French lands, which is France, Belgium, and the lowlands up here. And then some of the states of Italy here, and then some of the Balkan states here. That is the French Empire. The Grand Empire is kind of the next step out from that. The Grand Empire includes the French Empire and Spain, Italy, this Confederation of the Rhine, a new state he created, which we'll talk about more in a minute here, and then the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which we'll talk about in a minute here as well. And then the third level is the Allied states, and that is Austria, Prussia, and Russia. So those are the 3 Allied states. And even though they're enemies of Napoleon, they're allied with him because he defeated them. They had to be allied with him. And then, of course, there's only a few countries that are at war still with Napoleon, really only significantly England, and Portugal is going to become an important part of that in his fall. Yes, Sweden is at war with him, but we can't really qualify them as significant. Sorry, Swedes. But knowing this map, this is an important map to know. So make sure that you're able to reference that. So now let's talk about the new states that he created. The Confederation of the Rhine that we just alluded to. This is the leftover Holy Roman Empire. This was referred to in your reading. So this isn't Prussia. This isn't Austria. This is the leftover Holy Roman Empire. Once again, gone, off the map. He also created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Now, this is actually kind of a funny story. France wanted Poland back. Remember the partition of Poland? It was taken away. But France and Poland had long been allies. A Catholic state in the East, the French aristocracy, the Polish aristocracy spoke French. And so France really wanted a Poland in Eastern Europe, but Russia refused, and they didn't want a Poland. So Napoleon compromised and created a Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which wasn't a kingdom of Poland. Now, it's not really going to be significant in the long term, but it's kind of an interesting story the way it worked out there. Now, for Napoleon, ruling time was family time. The family that rules together stays together. And his brothers Joseph, Louis, and Jerome all were made kings of different areas. Joseph was in Naples in Spain. He's going to be the most significant. Jerome's in Westphalia, Louis in Holland. His sisters, brother-in-law, uncle were also ruled different states. Napoleon only trusted family members immediately under him, which is kind of one of those contradictions. You know, he promoted merit and those who were able, but he only trusted his family members to carry out his closest orders and his most important orders. Also, for a man who was all about, the republic and democracy, not really. He's essentially creating a dynastic family all around Europe, the Bonaparte family. Now, this is an important part to remember here. Your reading talked about it, and we've talked about it. Napoleon's armies are still spreading the revolution. A French army would enter an area, and once they conquered that area, they would use willing collaborators. So whether they were German or Italian or Polish, whoever, people who agreed with them, that would set up a temporary government that was loyal for France. And then they would begin a program of sweeping reforms, bringing in these Napoleonic and French Revolution to a lesser degree reforms. So let's talk about the reforms that Napoleon brought in. Now, his reforms were modeled on the Enlightenment, and he called his system liberal. And I guess if we're comparing it to an absolute monarchy, especially like there was in France and in Prussia, there were aspects that were liberal of it. He did have a constitutional government, but it was not limited. If you remember, if you go back to our John Locke, Locke talked about how a government should be limited. But that wasn't Napoleon's case. He thought the government should be all-powerful and should be able to touch every aspect of people's lives. The reason he thought it was liberal is it was spelled out and justified. He said there was a social contract. There was an agreement between the governed and the governing to give all power to him to make things better. Now, a very, very important part of Napoleon is that he believed in universal truths. Put a star next to this, underline it, whatever it is. This goes back to our scientific revolution. The idea is looking for universal truths and universal laws. Napoleon believed that all people wanted and deserved the same things. This is very scientific revolution. This is very Enlightenment. That there's big picture truths that are true for everybody, whether you're Prussian, Italian, Austrian, French, that they all should be under the same rules. And because of this, he believed the Napoleonic Code, which we'll get to in a minute here, should be adopted everywhere with little change. No regional differences were necessary because all people both wanted and deserved the same things. And so this is the idea of the universal truths that's so important to understanding Napoleon and eventually understanding the backlash to Napoleon. That's foreshadowing there, seemingly useless bit of information that comes into play later. So now, the Napoleonic Code. This was called the Civil Code in your reading. I want you to take a minute and talk about the Napoleonic Code with your partner, and I want you to talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of the Napoleonic Civil Code. So take a couple minutes and kind of make a little status bar. What were the strengths? What were the weaknesses of it? A balance sheet. That's what I was looking for, not status bar. That's the little thing. Balance sheet. See what you can come up with. Strengths and weaknesses, Napoleonic Civil Code. Okay. So really, if we're looking at his reforms in kind of a big picture way, I think one of the best ways to look at them is his reforms were against everything feudal. He is getting rid of the last vestiges of feudalism as best he can. And a big tie-in to this is his belief in a merit-based society, obviously with caveats like his family and stuff. But some aspects of his merit-based society, and your reading talked about these. The idea of military advancements, that ability was going to allow you to move up the ranks. That there's no selling of government offices and no hereditary offices just being inherited unless you were related to him. But don't worry about that. Nobility lost all of their privileges, their tax privileges, their land privileges. The peasants were free. There was no more serfdom, of course, but peasantry even, they were allowed to be free. And then one I think that's an important one that often is overlooked too, he encouraged schooling, which we're going to get to here in just a few minutes. And this idea, if you're allowing more and more people to go to school, that's going to allow individuals who aren't at the highest ranks of society to move up. And so this merit-based society is a very important one in Napoleon's reform program. So let's talk about his relationship with the church. Before we get into that, I actually want you to try to recall what's the relationship between the church and the revolutionary government. So immediately preceding Napoleon, talk about the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church, and this is just in France, the Roman Catholic Church and the French government. Right, so hopefully you brought up the radical phase, the bonnet rouge, oh, my hat. And you talked about how they were very anti-clerical, very anti-church, tied into the old regime, all these things. And Napoleon's going to change that. I'm just going to take off my hat here for a second, if you don't mind. Napoleon wasn't particularly religious himself. He didn't see it as very important in his life at all, but he did see it as useful. Now, your reading talked about the Concordat of 1801. You do need to know that term. This is a very important step along the way of a role between the relationship between the state and religion. The Concordat just means agreement. It's essentially a compromise. It's reconciliation with the church. And what Napoleon is doing is he's saying that the Catholic religion is of the great majority of France, but it's not the state religion. He's not picking an official religion, but he is recognizing it as the most important religion of France. But the church loses all their legal privileges. They lose the tie. They lose their political authority. So even though he's saying it's an important institution, he's saying it's important only religiously, and you're not getting anything from the state here. And this is an important step in religious tolerance, because tolerance is going to become the law. Whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, even a non-believer, which is a very small group, but there was tolerance. Now, this Concordat is so important because it allows people to be both Catholic and French. You could be pro-French government and still be with your church, which was a major problem for a lot of people during the Revolutionary era, especially during the radical phase. And so this is big, especially for the peasants who are religiously conservative. Now they can be connected to the state, to Napoleon's state, and not be against their religion. So now let's talk about his economic reforms. That was kind of mentioned in your reading, but I want to go into just a little more detail here. He creates a Bank of France, a national Bank of France, and this is going to help greatly with borrowing. It's not just him borrowing, it's not just the king borrowing, it is the state of France borrowing. So this is very significant. It's going to help them get more outside loans and internal loans from banks as well. He also does away with all guilds and any internal tariffs, anything that's going to limit trade. He does away with those. So again, some more kind of vestiges of the Middle Ages he's getting rid of. And then lastly, and this is probably most significant, is the land tax. The land tax becomes the standard tax. And this is a dramatic change from before the French Revolution. Before, the landowners, they paid no taxes. And now the more land you owe, the more taxes you pay. And that is going to set France on much better financial standings for the future. And one of the things I think that's important to understand about almost all of these reforms, the Napoleonic Code, merit-based society, all of these things, is they really set the stage for France for the long-term future. The Napoleonic Code is still the basis of the French law code today in 2016. It's still the basis for it. And so all of these things have very long-reaching implications. Another one of his reforms is he encouraged science. Like I said, he encouraged science. The schooling, he introduced the lycée, Lycees, kind of primary schooling for everybody so that they could learn and learn about these scientific and enlightened ideas. Everywhere he went, he brought a team of scientists with him. His discoveries, most importantly, in this regard, remembered for discovering the Rosetta Stone in Egypt. This is the actual one. I stole it from the British Museum. Don't tell anybody. Maybe I shouldn't have this on a publicly accessible video. But anyway, this is what eventually deciphered the hieroglyphics. That was actually the British who did it when they stole it from Napoleon after they defeated him. But regardless, it was this discovery that helped open up all the wonders of Egypt for us. Now, there were, of course, limits on his reform. We just spent all this time talking about his reform, but there were limits on his reform. Of course, women did not fare very well. In fact, their status declined from the Revolutionary period into the Napoleonic era. Some of the rights that they had been granted were taken away. Workers did not fare any better. This growing working class, which isn't really a thing yet, but they don't fare very well under this. And of course, there's no self-government of any kind. Napoleon rules everything. And there's really no strong elected officials. He had parliaments and diets and stuff like that all throughout his empire, but they really had no authority of any kind. Now, the last kind of part here is the bad part of Napoleon conquering you. So it wasn't all wonderful when he conquered you. All of the dependent states, so everywhere he conquered, the Grand Empire, the Allies, they all had to supply troops to Napoleon's army. And so they all had to send their young men to fight in his army. And then another part of it was they paid very high taxes to support France and Napoleon's army, and also to keep taxes in France low. So the French Empire, this part right here, paid low taxes, and everywhere else paid very high taxes. And so that was a negative, despite all of these reforms and stuff, there was a stick that went along with that carrot once you were conquered. This next quote here is paraphrasing Kagan once again, and I think it's very instructive to understanding how Napoleon was able to accomplish what he did. Since money was the largest limiting factor in waging war in the 19th century, Napoleon's ability to extract money from his allies allowed him to face the large coalitions fairly equally. So how was he able to fight, Prussia, Russia, Austria, Great Britain, all of these places? It's because he had enough money to raise and feed and pay enough soldiers to fight these other guys, whereas Austria was just in a financial debacle and they had to keep calling off campaigns because they didn't have the money. Plus, since he wasn't using French money to wage the war, since their taxes were so low, his home country was pleased. They weren't as critical of wars and battles, even if they didn't go great, because they weren't paying for them. So, Napoleon's support. Where did it come from? Who supported him? Who was fans of Napoleon? I think there's three big groups. First one, generally, and this is kind of a generic statement, and maybe not be universally true, but he was very popular in France and in the French Empire. In those places that, not surprisingly, had low taxes, he was very popular, and they saw him as his guy, and he was conquering all of this in their name. So his support was very popular in France, especially, and then in the French Empire. Then there was groups of people all over Europe who saw him as the legacy of the revolution. So liberals who saw the revolution as a positive and saw that it would have been taken out if not for Napoleon, if Prussia, Austria, Russia, or England were able to crush him. So those who saw him as the legacy of the revolution, which is debatable, but those who saw that greatly supported Napoleon. And then the third group was really the professional and commercial classes, these business classes who just wanted stability, who wanted to be able to trade and do business. And just the fervor and all the chaos of the revolutionary, especially the late revolutionary era, wasn't good for that. Napoleon brought standard rules, standard laws, standard tariffs, regulations that were going to help enable business to get done. So the commercial classes, professional and commercial classes, really enjoyed him. Now, generally speaking, he got less popular as you went further east in Europe, and he was also, of course, incredibly unpopular in Spain and England. Really universally unpopular in Spain and England, without a doubt. So that's not who supported him, or who didn't support him. Or it's got to be you. You got it. All right. So now let's talk about Napoleon versus everyone. Let's talk about kind of this big picture idea. Napoleon's overarching goal, his biggest goal that he wanted to do, was to conquer England. But not really. Okay, he did. His actual goal, as we talked about before, was to be the master of Europe. He wanted to dominate the continent. He couldn't actually have cared less about Great Britain. But he knew that Great Britain wouldn't let him dominate the continent, because that would disrupt the balance of power. So he knew he had to take England out to be master of the continent. And so his goal was to conquer Europe. But to do that, he knew he needed to conquer England. He knew he needed to conquer this little island there. He eventually tried to do it economically. He introduced the continental system, which was in your reading. And that's an incredibly important part of this. He's trying to set up a blockade of England to stop their goods from getting to the continent and anything getting to England. And he's trying to economically crush them. Now, England during this time is very disorganized. During the Napoleonic era, when there's just one Napoleon in charge of France, Napoleon had 6 different prime ministers, 9 different foreign secretaries, 6 secretaries of war, 8 first lords of the Admiralty, that's the guy in charge of the Navy. And so there's all kinds of leadership, turmoil, and chaos. But their system is so strong that they're still able to hold off Napoleon. So let's talk about some of the opposition to Napoleon's rule. I kind of have 2 points to talk about here. One is from Great Britain. And this is really the smuggling. So there's the continental system where England is getting blockaded by France. But the problem with this, of course, is that England has more boats. Yes, and France can't stop them. And so there's all kinds of rampant smuggling of English goods still making it to the continent. And in fact, it had an adverse effect, because if you outlaw English goods on the continent, when they're getting smuggled in, what happens to the price of those goods? Yeah, they actually go up because it's black market, it's contraband. And so it's just incredibly, incredibly difficult. And Napoleon's never successful cutting off England. In fact, Napoleon still imports an English beer. Bass beer was his favorite. And he still imported that from England for his own personal leisure. Now, after the Battle of Trafalgar, which is a famous naval battle off the coast of Spain, France really has no way to defeat England militarily. It made no way that France's navy was going to be big enough to defeat them in the seas, to invade England. And this is, again, because England had more boats. Napoleon brings about some fanciful ways. He actually talks to engineers about digging a tunnel under the English Channel so that his army could march right there. His engineers are like, that's not possible, dude. But obviously, foreseeing the channel tunnel that's there now by 2 centuries, he also, no pun intended, actually, yeah, it is. He floated the idea of trying to invade England with the newest aviation invention, hot air balloons, which just would have to be the most beautiful and not intimidating invasion ever. Like if you're picturing the coast of England and these hot air balloons just kind of blowing over. But neither of these things worked. And so, England's opposition remained strong and steadfast throughout. Now, another problem, and you'll read about this, is the Peninsular War. Portugal, who remains at war with Napoleon, they refuse to adhere to the continental system. And so they continued trading with England. They continued trading English goods. They're not following Napoleon's tariffs. So Napoleon's going to invade Portugal. To get there, he has to cut through Spain. And this Peninsular War just absolutely bogs him down. It becomes a guerrilla war. Spanish irregulars fighting against France's army. It's actually where we get the word guerrilla, meaning little war, guerre, the French word for war, or Spanish word for war, or both. And then guerrilla meaning diminutive, little war. And so that opposition to Napoleon is just eventually going to be one of the things that crushes him, which we'll get to at the end when we talk about his fall a little bit more. So hopefully you have a better idea of Napoleon, the man, the myth, the legend, what he really was. And so with that, I bid you au revoir.